Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
It's as plain as the nose on my face. Stories matter, and especially how those stories are told. And if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you are in the seats with, once more, as always. My name is Dave Voigt, and I'm the host of this podcast where we sit down with a wide-ranging variety of entertainment industry professionals and pick their brains not just on current projects, but state of the business, state of the world, how they got started, all sorts of things under the sun in a very light and conversational manner as best we can. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, and we hope that you do because you're listening, you can do that either over at Apple Podcasts, over at Spotify, or you can find every single one of our episodes archived over at our YouTube channel at In the Seats. We'd really love it too if you would give us a follow on the social media, because it matters. You can find us over on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, either at In the Seats or at It's Podcast One for all sorts of updates. And finally, and probably most importantly, because it's where it all began, please visit us over at In the Seats, intheseats.ca, for all sorts of movie news, reviews, from anything cinematic, television, moving image that comes at us from all across the world. And our team is working hard, and I know they'd love it if you'd come pay them a visit to recommend what to watch these days while we're sitting in various degrees of lockdown and not being social and trying to get this bug under control, because that's just what we got to do. But on this episode, we've got a good one. We got an interesting one. We're talking with director Sam Feder about their film Disclosure, which is on Netflix right now, and it is a documentary which really does a deep dive into Hollywood's depiction and representation of transgender people throughout the years, and sort of the impact that these stories have had not only on the lives of transgender people, but on American culture as well. And it's a real interesting, and it's a real important deep dive. And we talked to Sam about a myriad of different topics, and just sort of having to go back into the pop culture lexicon and sort of break down sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of it all, and where we're going to go from here. And also just in terms of, especially as a filmmaker, if this is the kind of film that Sam can let go, because it's one of those pieces of work that's going to stick with you, and it's going to make you want to have conversations. And I mean, I think of any good piece of art, that's probably the important thing to do. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Sam, because I certainly know that I did.
Cool, I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, let's talk about the movie. I mean, I guess first off, I did want to say congratulations on the film. I really found it to be very sort of, I don't want to say thought-provoking in sort of an overly dramatic way, but it was something that as I was watching, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Oh, right. It was one of those things as a straight white guy that made me a little more sort of, I don't want to say open, because I mean, I try to be open just as a human being, but just sort of in terms of awareness, sort of on the grander scale, especially from a pop culture standpoint. And I'm kind of curious, what was the impetus for you to sort of tell this story?
No, I love that you open with that sort of personal perspective. One of our executive producers, this woman named Caroline Labresco, who was a senior programmer at Sundance for, 25 years, a very obviously worldly cultured woman. She said, she thought she was pretty progressive. And then when she saw our materials, she was like, oh, I didn't think I cared about this stuff. Like, I didn't think trans issues were important to me. And then suddenly they were. And I think it's so interesting to think about how having a common language of Hollywood, right, of this shared experience that so many people have taken for decades and decades, has allowed this new access point, to talk about something that people have been trying to engage for so long, are likely allies that just haven't come on board, I feel like we're seeing a bigger shift because we have this common language. And that it was that sort of meeting of the worlds that made me want to make the film. Because in 2014, I had been making films for about 10 years about the trans community, and it's my community. And that year was when Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine.
Mm.
And when that cover hit the newsstands, trans people had barely been mentioned by the mainstream, let alone celebrated. So I was really confused about what was going on. And also I was scared because whenever a marginalized community gets mainstream attention, backlash ensues. Right. And at that point, trans women were already, specifically Black trans women, were already experiencing an epidemic of murder. So I was excited that Laverne was getting this attention and this podium, and I knew she would use it for good because I knew her from her activist days in New York. And I was really concerned about the backlash, the social and the legislative backlash that was going to ensue, which we have seen. So in that paradox, sort of in that liminal space, I found possibility to ask all these questions. And I thought making a film about the history of that representation would start to create the context to answer the questions I had.
No, and I mean, I think you're absolutely right, because I mean, I can imagine from your perspective, especially starting research on the film and going through everything, just at least from my initial standpoint, I never sort of connected the representation of drag to trans representation as well. But as you laid it out, it kept making more and more sense, especially sort of in the moments that the film highlighted with Black comedians who generally, sort of, for a comedian, if you're a Black man, it's almost deemed a rite of passage to do drag, but really at the same time, it's meant as sort of a method of disempowerment in many ways. And it's one of those things where it really shows an interesting line between, I guess, in terms of context, I'm trying to word this the right way, in terms of trying to find the line between where the fun, like the joke ends, and the reality of what they're trying to do to sort of a group of individuals begins, if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. I mean, I think, the biggest takeaway with making the film, even for myself, even something I had to come to terms with again and again, even though I know in my bones how true it is that none of this is just entertainment. Like, this all impacts how we understand ourselves and how we see the world so deeply, right? And so it's, when we were looking at the history, language changes over time, identity changes over time, but what I was really looking at is what images inform what people think about us. Right. And so it doesn't have to be overtly someone having a sex change and going into the world, but like, what are the images about transgressing gender that impact how the public and how trans people understand what it means to be trans in the world? And all of those tiny, tiny clips that we see over our lifetime completely build, this city of knowledge of how, when we see a trans person in the world, becomes our reference. And then the impact when we're bringing in what you're talking about with White Famous and the comedians and the Black comedians, and what Laverne was talking about, how she thinks that has informed particularly how, around like lynching and castration. I mean, that's deep and it's real. And we see it in our culture and our cultural understanding, in the deeply, racist politics we're surrounded by. It's so present. And, film and TV it's like the national church in a lot of ways, right? It's like, it's the biggest cultural link, of our time. I think I read somewhere that people see more than 3,000 media images a day. And that's including pre-COVID times of walking around and you see the billboards and the bus at the bus stop or driving on the highway, right? But that's like to imagine that at any given time, you're taking in 3,000 images a day passively, right? Like, how does that affect your psyche? How does that affect your bias? How does that affect your ideology? So yes, to your point.
When it comes to, and I mean, there's something else that the film really does bring up that I'm always kind of curious about, because representation is obviously an incredibly important thing, and there needs to be more of it. But at the same time, I also struggle with sort of the intention of the artist telling the story, and also just sort of the practical nature of it as well. And I'm kind of curious, because I love how the film obviously will highlight some of the problematic sort of depictions that we've seen in the media, but it also does bring it up. It will at least show the times where the industry is at least kind of getting it right.
Yeah, I mean, not only did we want to include times the industry was trying, like there was clearly someone behind the scenes who was fighting, but also even when the times or the examples where it's so overtly getting it wrong, I felt it was important to also show how for some people it was still a positive experience,
Yeah.
just to show how complicated this all is. Like there's that section, Boys Don't Cry section has it really a lot. You see a lot of guys talking about how this was a really meaningful film for them. They saw themselves, and you see a lot of people talking about how like the violence has stayed with them for 20 years and why did it have to be that way? And then of course the erasure of a Black man. But then with The Crying Game, this is one of my favorite moments because, there's a whole section on The Crying Game and Ace Ventura and the legacy of that. And how painful seeing, the vomiting and the violence and the joke, all in this one trope. And then Zachary Drucker comes in, and she has such an interesting story because when she was like 6 years old or something, her mother was working on her PhD about The Crying Game. So The Crying Game was playing in her living room growing up a lot. And instead of her takeaway being like this traumatic memory, her memory was, I saw a beautiful woman with a penis, and that completely expanded my world and made my life possible. Right. So this film that all of us are kind of like, it ruined us. It's trauma. I think about all the time. For Zachary, it was completely transformative in the most positive way. And so Laverne and Amy and I and our whole team were really committed to bringing nuance to everything. And we didn't want anything to be finger wagging. It couldn't be all critique because nothing is black and white. And so in addition to, yes, showing how the industry has tried to do it right, it is always very complicated.
Do you think is there a right answer, or is this one of those questions that culturally and even from a pop culture standpoint, you think we're going to keep debating and keep sort of struggling with, especially in terms of showing it sort of in a respectful and proper way?
Up until very recently, my answer to that question would be very vague because I really hadn't quite figured it out.
Yeah.
And I would say things like, we just need more, we need more trans people behind the scenes, like these things that sounded right, but I wasn't really sure what was going to happen. Though I knew in my bones what we needed was, clearly we needed trans people behind the scenes. We needed people who had a stake in the game, who had lived the life, who had had intimate experiences with trans people. But we also needed stories that were nuanced. Like this word, I just can't use it enough. Like there is such a lack of nuance in dominant storytelling when we're talking about marginalized communities. And that perpetuates such harm. Like it reduces people to such superficial levels, which then dehumanizes them, which then makes it really easy to have violence off the screen, right? These are the life and death stakes, right? When someone is reduced and dehumanized and distorted, and violence follows. And so, but I was like, how do we get that nuance for trans people? And then I finally saw it. And there's this episodic, based on a true story show that came out of Madrid this year. They filmed it during COVID, made by these two young gay guys in Madrid. And they're called the Javis. I think they're a couple. And it's called Veneno. And it's based on this woman called La Veneno. And in this series, you see complicated, messy, problematic characters, but they're so complete. They're real people. So you see the love and the joy and the tenderness, and the vulnerabilities. And they're also sex workers, and there's crime, and but none of that holds much weight because they're people. And that's the recipe, right? Yeah. It's like when all you see is a sex worker, and again, they're not a person anymore. They're just a sex worker. Yes, trans people do sex work. Non-trans people do sex work. That can certainly be part of our stories. But when it's all you see, is trans people getting killed again and again and again, all they are dead bodies, right? So it's like, how do we, I don't want to shy away from the messy truth, but have the messy truth around real people, around real lives. And that's how we move away from the dehumanization.
No, and you're absolutely right, because there have been so many depictions of just, the community being the victim, the community being abused, the community being murdered. But and this can be true in sort of all forms of pop culture, that we've lost the context and we've lost the nuance, as you say, of telling stories about actual people rather than telling stories about, oh, this is a trans sex worker. It's like, okay, well, that's nice that they're a trans sex worker, but they're a person. Let's find about them as a person.
Right.
And I mean,
Right. Exactly.
I,
Yeah.
lo-
And
I
it's much
love,
more interesting.
yeah. I mean, I love how the film also really did its research and went sort of deep into the archives to imagine to a lot of some stuff from the silent era as well. And can you talk to me a little bit just about sort of how much of a deep dive you had to do sort of into the past of Hollywood to sort of find the right starting point for it all? Because I love that you went back as far as you possibly could.
Yeah, we have clips in there from the Edison studio, right? Like in 1903, and I think I actually found something at one point from 1898. Um, but the clip we ended up using just made more sense and it was better. But so when I decided to make this film, a lot of my inspiration was not only the story I told you of the decision to make it, but it was a lifetime of taking these images. And early on in my education around film, I saw Ethnic Notions that came out in the 80s, I think 85. And it's a film by Marlon Riggs, and it's about the representation of Black people in film and TV. And that completely changed my relationship as a white person to media and understanding how I've been informed and taught and compared to my real life relationships with Black people. So that was molecule changing for me early on. And then in the 90s, the film Celluloid Closet came out, and that looked at the representation of gay and lesbian people in film and TV. And as a queer person, that really resonated on a personal level. Again, how I internalized things about myself and how I knew the world thought about my life. So these two films really had a huge impact. And I wanted to know for a long time what this history would look like for trans people. So when I started it, I assumed there would be a book, right? Because both of those previous films have been based on books.
Right.
So I looked for the book on trans representation and it didn't exist.
You haven't written it yet, right?
So nope, it hadn't been written. And that was scary. And I really didn't know how to do this, right? Because documenting a history is so ethically precarious, right? We know this. Howard Zinn lays this out for us. Historians have shown us again and again how dangerous it is to tell a history, and it's so clear who's telling it and their stake in it. And I know that's in this film, and I know we made mistakes, and I can't wait to see how people do things better in the future. But anyway, point being is rather than my singularly going from the first step to the archives and to the studios and trying to find the footage, to the academy and looking through all the films, what I did for the first 6 to 8 months was oral histories with trans people that I knew who had worked on one side of the camera or the other. And I traveled around the country. I did Zooms. This is before COVID. I did Zooms with my friends internationally, trans people who had worked in film and TV, and just talked about what did they remember seeing? Like, what are the films and television shows that impacted them, that stayed with them, right? And then that's how I started gathering my database initially. And after I did that, I did about 70 of those, and 50 of those we recorded, and we're going to create some sort of project with those. But after I had that sort of foundation, that's when I started to go to the archives and to look at these clips. And then I started to find more, right? Because I would find one director, in the early 1900s who kept kind of making these drag and female impersonations and these stories about a boy who would, put on a dress so he could be on the soccer team and be closer to his girlfriend. I would figure out which actors and directors kind of had a propensity for these stories and then find it in their other work, right? You see this again. You even see this today. People revisit the themes in their work. So that's kind of how it started. And then I would go to specialized museums like Asian History Museum or Black History Museum, a Southeast Asian History Museum, and ask them, did they remember seeing any images of trans people? And so just built it from there. And I built an archive of over 600 television clips and over 400 film clips.
Now, and I mean, this can be true across sort of all walks of life, but I mean, it's human nature that we all want to categorize each other and put each other in boxes and labels and this, that, and the other. But there is pushback against that. And this feels very much like like a needed reminder to sort of to push back against that and remind sort of the masses, be it from a pop culture standpoint or from just a pure humanitarian standpoint, that people are people and not just sort of generalize, because we have gotten that sort of generalization pretty commonly in our mass media, especially over the last few years.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there a question on that?
I'm just curious about what you feel about that, because I mean it's one of those things where I always look at sort of the ebb and the flow of like pop culture trends and sort of how people react to them, because I mean there are trans people, there have been trans people since before there were film, but now we're talking about trans people and we're talking about the community as opposed to it just not being there. If that makes any sense. I think it all just goes back to sort of the whole issue around representation in media and sort of being able to focus on stories about people as opposed to focusing on stories about people of one division or of another division, and just tell stories about people in general.
Yeah, that makes me think about humans need order, like as you're referencing. We need order, we need boxes. That's how we survive. That's very basic to human nature.
Yeah.
And understanding self versus other, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I mean, unfortunately, the world we live in is everything is based on capitalism. Everything is
Yeah.
based on the bottom line.
Yeah.
So the more we can, otherize and victimize and the other, the more we gain, right? So the more we tell these stories that make people feel separate from someone else and therefore better from someone else, the more ticket sales, right? That becomes this like, that is just what executives see as money, right? They
Yeah.
know, okay, you're gonna laugh at the trans person, that'll bring the crowds, that'll go out the social media, so just this simplicity down to the bottom line. And that's tricky, right? Because, okay, so we diversify the industry, but it's still about the bottom line. Is it really going to change? But my hope is that it will. Like, if you put people who have a stake in the game, when it's their life, right, that is contingent on that bottom line, I think it will change things. I hope it changes things. But ultimately, I do kind of ping pong in this world of like, but we're in a capitalist world. Like, will we ever see like the true change we need to value human life? That is the question I struggle with every day. I don't
But
know.
and I mean, and that's got to be the goal for you as a filmmaker as well, because I mean, like you say, it's there isn't necessarily going to be sort of this whole and tonal shift that maybe you'd hope and would want, but if films like yours are getting conversation going and getting people talking, it's at least sort of pushing that boulder in the right direction, if you know what I mean.
I think so. I hope so. I mean, I know. So there's two things I want to say about that. I know the impact we've had already, beyond the entertainment industry, which I'd love to tell you about, but also the way we made the film. Like, since when I was in my early 20s, I've been making I've been telling stories since I was like 15. I did photography, and then I took a little break for a while and did some sculpture. And I just remember at one point really coming to terms with myself of, my ego and what does it mean to have an audience? And what if something you make and you love and you pour your heart into doesn't resonate with anyone else? And I just had this moment of the process in itself has to be an end at all times. It can't be a means to an end. Like the process has to be as meaningful as the end product. And the process of making disclosure, you know, I felt that I wanted to have a positive impact in the process on real people in real time. So we prioritized hiring trans people. And when we couldn't hire a trans person, we mentored a trans person, and everyone was paid. And it was incredibly nourishing, beautiful environment where lives were changed. People networked and trans people were centered again, day after day after day, and valued for their work, for their voices, for their life experience. And it really made a huge impact on people. And I'm still hearing about it. And that in itself, I'm like, okay, the process was an end in itself. It made a difference in people's lives, and that is huge. It also made a difference in in our protagonists, in our stars, in the cast, and the characters, because they were coming on a set that was centered on trans people, and for most trans people, any room you walk into, you're the only trans person there, and you're heightened, your sensitivities are heightened, you're a little nervous. You know, who's going to do what, who's going to say what, will anyone have your back? And now to be able to walk into a room and be able to relax and just do your job, right? That changes you, right?
Yeah.
That changes how you're also going to, your expectations and what you deserve. So that was one thing as a filmmaker that I'm committed to, that the process has to better lives, right? Every day. I'm starting a new project, and that's going to be, the fellowship is already baked in, and that's something that I'm going to bake into every project I'm part of. Um, and then on the other hand, you know, since our release, we've already seen, like, I've had lawyers contact us and say, you know, I had to watch Disclosure, or I wanted to watch Disclosure before I created, you know, the argument to defend my trans client. Like, oh, that is exactly what I wanted this film to do. I wanted this film to be a tool for people who want to help trans people, right? And then for trans people, I've heard that, like, watching the film has been like therapy, like a little hard, a little painful, little like dealing with things you maybe didn't want to think about or had put it to rest. But at the end, it was really healing. And now they felt empowered to have this history and be able to share it with other people, to say, look, this is something that I experienced. I want you to understand this about me. And then there were a group of judges in California that reached out for clips that they could share in their training materials among themselves. Like, I didn't realize judges were, you know, improving themselves. I thought once you're a judge, you're done and you just get to make the rules. But they have these training groups, and they use just clips from Disclosure to talk about how the bias they might have towards trans people coming into the courtroom. I mean, that's the kind of hearing about, like, I'm thrilled that the industry is impacted by the film and changing the way they're doing things, but knowing that people who are, you know, having power over trans people on a daily basis are changing their views and understanding the bias they might have, that is incredible. That is so meaningful, and that is such a privilege to be able to have made work that has that kind of impact in the world.
And you know, that's the whole point of art. It's you're supposed to be able to make something that will have an impact on the world, be it, you know, for like socially, emotionally, God willing, financially. But I mean, it's one of those things that really is, it's important to sort of get down to the core of the process when you're making any any kind of piece of art, to be able to have an impact on the world. And I think this is something that really does have an impact, because it comes doesn't come from a place of judgment or finger wagging, as it were. It comes from a place of honesty and sort of openness to sort of not just educate, but sort of create a safe space, not only for trans people, but for people wanting to understand more about trans people.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for saying that.
Now, I mean, I'm kind of curious, just to put a bow on this, and this is something I always like to ask people. Sort of in the younger days, can you boil it back to sort of a movie or a moment that sort of you think maybe got you on your path, that got you sort of into storytelling, and particularly into documentary storytelling?
Well, when I was 15, um, I got a Pentax K1000, which is like the most manual black and white camera, right, that exists. And I got it from B&H Photo, which is a very well-known New York photography store. And my father took me there and he bought me the camera, and I took my first camera class. And at the same time, Magic Johnson came out as HIV positive.
Right.
And one of my mentors, my science teacher, Laura Seidman, she was a huge Magic Johnson fan, and she organized us at that point around AIDS education, and I got incredibly politicized. And so I immediately started to get sensitized to how the media stigmatized people who were positive, and stigmatized the AIDS crisis and the AIDS movement. And I began telling stories about people living with AIDS. And so and it was just a few years after that I started making films about trans people. And so I'm not sure if that's answers your question, but that was the sort of social political climate of my teenage life, that I started making work in. And it, always looking at race, class, and gender and the intersection of the three, were integral to my practice from that moment, from when I was 15.
No, and I'm no, it does. And I mean, you're throughout your career, you've told some very sort of well, you've told very personal stories, but I mean, I'm kind of curious, just as a sort of content creator, as an artist, as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, how do you let these stories go, or can you ultimately let them go when you're moving on to the next project?
Oh God. And by let them go, what do you mean?
Just in terms of being happy with it or being satisfied, but also sort of
Mm.
having the attachment to it on how sort of it has sort of not just performed maybe on Netflix or financially or what have you, but how it's been received and how people are talking about it. Because I mean, sometimes you can make something and put it out into the world and nobody sees it, and you just have to sort of make your peace with that and move on. But conversely, this is something that a lot of people are seeing.
Wow. I can we actually extend this for like an hour and I pay you for therapy? Because I would love to get into this. It is, whew, that just sent me down a rabbit hole. I am not over any of my work. I still take, it's this like line of like taking it personally and taking responsibility. And I take
Right.
responsibility so seriously. And so I still think about choices I made that I wouldn't make again, or like how something made someone feel. And that deeply informs my next project, right?
Mm.
It is this sort of, okay, that didn't go right. How am I going to do it better next time? And that was deeply painful in the beginning, but now I see that as like such an opportunity, to do it better, and an exciting opportunity, right? To take accountability and to do things better. And I think that's how we heal as a culture. So on one hand, behind closed doors, I'm attached to everything I've ever made still, and I'm still having, my interiority is still at war with itself on
Right.
everything. But I do know once you lock edit, you picture lock, and the film is out there, there's a lot of work to be done to let people, I've had my voice, right? I've had my opportunity to say my piece, and now other people get their time. I recently turned down being on a panel because because of that in particular. It was about trans representation.
Right.
And sure, I have things to say about it, but I've had my piece. And not only have I had my piece with disclosure, but now for the past year I've been able to talk about it at these events and with press. And I want other people to not only be able to talk about it, but I want people to talk about disclosure and maybe critique it, right? Maybe talk about things they didn't love. And if I'm on the panel, they're not gonna feel as free. And I want people to critique disclosure and make something better. I want trans people to now find the things that I didn't do and do them better. So that's kind of how I manage letting that go, is
Right.
knowing that the more I let go, it gives it gives other people opportunity, and it allows us as a culture to evolve.
Well, you know what? That's you know what. Thank you for that answer, and thank you for making a film that I think will help a lot of people evolve, even if it's in the smallest of ways. And congratulations on the film, and thank you so much for the time today.
Thanks, David. It was really nice chatting with you.
Likewise, thanks again, Sam. And don't forget to visit our friends over at Bay Street Video for all your DVD, Blu-ray rental, or purchasing needs this summer, as they are still open for curbside and some mailing delivery as well. Over at 1172 Bay Street, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, you can give them a call at 416-964-9088. That's 416-964-9088. Or send them an email at baystreetvideoto@gmail.com for any of your DVD and Blu-ray needs.